Greg, we want to welcome you to today's Starfish in the Church podcast. I don't think we could be more excited. I know that Rob couldn't be more excited. We've got him.
Yes, it's Christmas. It's Christmas morning.
He's fanboy geeking out today like I've never seen him before, and that says a lot, let me tell you.
It's true.
But really, we are very excited today. We've got Greg Boyd, who is the founder and senior pastor of Woodland Hills Church in the Twin Cities. One of the things that I'm excited about having Greg with us, I was reflecting on this. We recently lost Eugene Peterson, one of the great theologians of our time. And man, I put Greg right up there. Greg is one of the voices that we have with us in our generation that has been such a blessing, continues to be a blessing. He challenges us. He holds the Word of God dearly, and he's just one of the tops to me. So we're blessed. Greg holds a PhD from Princeton Seminary.
He's a show off.
We could spend the rest of the day talking about how many books he's written, so we can't even name all the books, but I know some of the most recent ones: Crucifixion of the Warrior God and Cross Vision. And we're excited to have Greg with us.
Thanks, guys. That was over the top.
Wait. Greg, I haven't even started yet.
I know Eugene Peterson. I just got to get that out there. I can take accolades.
I know. We're embarrassing, Greg. Rob,
my head's falling over.
Rob, would you, for maybe some of the first-time listeners, would you share with the listeners kind of the metaphor and what the Starfish in the Church podcast is all about?
You bet. So in 2008, I was getting on a plane to fly to India, and I had the privilege of being a part of a grassroots movement there that was going viral in terms of church plants. And I got this copy of a book that just had come out by Ori Brofman. And as I read it on the way to India, it unlocked for me a lot of what was happening on the ground in terms of leadership. And the metaphor is primarily this: you have a starfish and a spider, and from an outside perspective, from a distance, they actually look kind of similar, but internally they're completely different. And so a spider is, if you chop off the head of a spider, the spider's done. But if you chop off the arm of a starfish, the starfish reproduces. You've got two. And that's because the starfish is actually a decentralized network. And inside of every cell is everything needed to reproduce. And Ori is, he's a professor at Berkeley. You wouldn't say that he would fly his flag as a follower of Jesus, but he would tell you historically, if you look, Jesus is really the origin of this kind of servant-based, empowering, equipping, non-coercive, decentralized kind of leadership. And the early church stands out in history as the best example of it. But over 1,700 years of Christendom, when the bishops shook hands with Rome, they started to rebuild the church in the image of Rome, and it became more and more hierarchical. And so now a lot of churches operate like pyramids with a few at the top and a whole bunch of people underneath supporting the few, whereas the Jesus movement is about circles, open circles, reproducing circles. And so this podcast is about rediscovering that. And that's why I'm so excited to actually have Greg today. Greg, for me in my journey over the last decade, I've been one of your podritioners. You've been one of my pastors from afar. I've digested, I think, all of your books except for one. I've passed them on to my children. You helped me through a very difficult time of sort of deconstruction and helped me rediscover again the beauty and the power and the authority of Scripture in a new way. And I also think your particular theological angle is the one that I feel like best funds the kind of leadership we're talking about. So welcome to the podcast, man.
Thanks a lot. It's an honor to be here. Appreciate it. And thanks for all those nice words. Hey, can I ask a question before we get started? With the starfish analogy. So if a starfish gets a leg cut off, now I always just thought it grew back. But the way you said it that leg becomes another starfish?
Yeah, you actually end up with two complete starfish. Yeah. So it's a pretty amazing metaphor for both. For example, Jesus said, go make disciples. What's implicit in that is every disciple needs to be a disciple who can make a disciple. Like reproductive Reproductivity is a part of what it means to follow Jesus.
Yeah. Well, that's really fascinating. I didn't know that.
Yeah, it's
Learn something new every day.
Hey, we taught Greg Boyd something today. Hello.
There you go.
Man, we're wicked smart.
So let's start hearing from Greg. That's why people are on here today. They want to hear from Greg. So Rob, drop the puck on a couple of things that we talked about earlier that we feel like Greg will just be able to run with.
Yeah, Greg, usually we tee off our conversation. We're trying to create a safe space where it's okay to recognize that a lot of people, like millions of people, because of the prevailing model of leadership in the church, have experienced genuine hurt, woundedness. They have felt oppressed, not liberated. So we usually ask leaders if they would consider either sharing a story of where they maybe went sideways in their own leadership, or maybe there's a time in your life where it felt like the leadership paradigm in the church was oppressing you. So we'll just tee it up.
Wow.
What do you think? Easy question to start with.
It is easy, but it's also difficult because I'm trying to think here. I can't remember a time being in church, and I went to Catholic school, was raised in that whole thing, then lost my faith and then came back to Christ. But I can't remember any time prior to, my starting Woodland Hills where I didn't feel there's some kind of oppression going on in the church. It was just a constant. Mm-hmm. But yeah, you accept that as normal. That's just the way it's supposed to be, but it can be catastrophic. So there's this one example of I was an associate pastor at this church. And,
so what do you like? Are you in your early 20s or something? Is this your first gig?
Early 20s, 23, 24. And this was my first gig. And so I was in seminary, but I was this time as a part-time pastor. But then the pastor left. And as soon as he left, it became really clear that this church had this deep division that goes back like 50 years between two families, and they're always recruiting allies, and they're always trying to get control of the board. Mm-hmm. And it was the sheer charisma of the former pastor that kept a lid on this. Although it pop out, but I didn't know anything about those pop outs. When they left, everything explodes because now they're looking to try to manipulate me and be on their side, and it was just crazy. And finally brought a person in who got in on one vote, and it immediately started restructuring the board. He got rid of the first board to get on the board that would be his allies. And they started abusing power, manipulating things, and funds began to disappear and all this stuff. And the sad thing was that he wasn't breaking any of the official church rules and doing it, kind of manipulating around it. And so you couldn't do anything about it. And then I had to report him to the hierarchy and this secular domination. And then it got more corrupt because they all, I don't know how much details to get in here, but there's a lot for this denomination to lose if this church decided to go with this pastor, even though I exposed the stuff. Mm. And they had to have this vote on it. And the vote didn't go the way the district wanted it. And so then they reversed the charges against him, and then pressed him against me for behavior that was not becoming of a pastor by bringing charges like this. And it was like, oh, that was the moment in my life when I most wanted to quit the church. It's like, Lord, I love you, but I don't want anything to do with this circus. It was.
So, Greg, where did it go from there? So formal charges are filed against you.
Yeah. Well, I was exonerated of everything. And they finally did, and then they had to bring charges against the one particular leader who had rescinded, actually had encouraged me to send this out, but then turned as a charge against me once it didn't go the way the district wanted. And so it was mayhem. It eventually settled. I left the church immediately after filing the charges because I knew that, I was done. And my wife was 8 months pregnant at the time, so this wasn't very convenient. And I'm going to seminary. This is not the way you should do seminary. So I ended up leaving, and he held on to the church and the power.
And the unfortunate thing is that story right there is just not uncommon. I mean, so many stories with a few little variables. Yeah, I know. It's just over and over and over and over we see it. And
the times we usually, it's there all the time. It's just it's only when it breaks that we really can draw attention to it. But
exactly.
it's pervasive.
Yeah, so it's about culture. That culture exists, and occasionally a crisis makes it burst up to the surface, and then you have headline stories of pastors falling, which unfortunately happens on a regular basis. So let's jump forward a little bit further in your story. You end up starting a new church, and you're of course now creating a new culture in that church. So what were the ideas? What were the foundational scriptures? What were the values that you were intentionally trying to bake into the culture that would create a different form of leadership or ethos for leadership?
Okay, I've got to be honest with you here. I would like to answer your question in the affirmative, saying, it was these scriptures that led me into this plurality of leadership. God moved on me in mighty ways. And I'm afraid that's not, I didn't know anything about anything when we started this church. In fact, I resisted the idea of starting a church. The superintendent wanted me to, I'd been filling in the pulpits, and that had gone pretty well. So he said, let's just plant you in one place and build a church around you. And I didn't want that because I have one virtue, and that is knowing what I'm not good at. And most things I'm not good at, and I don't like to do things I'm not good at. And so because I can spend 90% of my energy doing something I'm not good at and get a 25% result, or do 25% of energy in something I'm really good at and I get a 100% result. So I from the start, they got me to agree to doing this by having another person who's supposed to run the whole church, and so I finally agreed to that. So he'd run the whole church. Well, that didn't work out very well because whoever's the speaker, everyone identifies as the leader. This person's doing all the work, and so they're getting kind of envious and jealous, and it just did not work. So when that person left, here I am, and I don't want to run this thing. I hate finances. I'm no good at finances or budgets or organizations or anything. Ask anybody. I don't have an organizational brain cell. But we had the people who started filling the gap, just stepping up. And a lot of times they would start doing it as just volunteer or working with other volunteers. And then we'd say, hey, we need this person to be doing this full time. And so we by default ended up with a plural leadership, and then began to discover just how biblical that is.
Wow.
And we discovered how biblical it is because we discovered how difficult it is. And so we'd have a lot of discussions about this, like, how does this operate, and there'd be lines of confusion. And so we had to search the scriptures to decide what is the biblical model on these things. We came up with plural leadership.
I love what you just said there, Greg, about it being difficult. And, I've run into this a lot in talking with leaders about the possibilities of more of a plural, flattened leadership. And, a lot of people just dismiss it by saying, that won't work. I think you really pinpointed a big part of it. The fact is, it's a lot more work than just anointing a king and saying, this guy, the buck stops here. Right?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. And when you structure a church in that hierarchical way, the more it's structured like that, it self-selects the kind of people who will aspire to that. The people who run the billion-dollar Fortune 500 companies, they're very, very rare because they've got to be so motivated and so sold out and so gifted and workaholics. And the CEO, type A male, and on the whole, that's what it favors. And so you get the same thing in church. And so the church becomes you help me carry out my vision for my life. I see myself as a mega church, and they will never say that out loud probably, but that's driving a lot of it. And that's what you get what you ask for. So if you're going to structure like that, you get a certain kind of take charge, control, all that. Which is why it's abused so much.
Greg, one of the things that you've written about that I think speaks to this directly, you talk about the difference between power over and power under, and how God uses his power in ways that are non-coercive. And I think that is fundamental to this type of leadership that we're striving for, the Starfish leadership. So can you unpack what you mean by that and where you find that foundation in the scripture. Because a lot of people look and say, well, the God I see in the Bible is very hierarchical. It is absolutely top down. It is command and control. So isn't that what the church should look like?
Good. Very good question. And I have how much time here?
Go for it. We're in no hurry.
It's like,
hey, if it's boring, we'll just edit it out.
Okay, yeah, just shut me up. Okay. That's not for Greg right now. No, this is foundational to everything. One of the most shocking things ever in the Bible is found in a verse that has gotten too little attention, and it's when Paul says that the cross, while it's foolishness and weakness to the world, to we who are being saved, it is the wisdom and the power of God. So the cross is the power of God. One of the ways that you know that is a divine revelation is because we know what it looks like when human beings make God in our own image. We've got a whole history of that, and we always ascribe to them, always have, still do, ascribe to them the kind of power that we would want to have if we were God. That's the power to defeat your enemies and to impose your will on others and to get your way. Right? And so in a lot of theologies, God is simply the mega, I get my way. And everybody just follows his will deterministically and so on and so forth. But for Paul, here comes the guy against the whole history of religion where we see the kind of power we ascribe to God. Here Paul says that the cross is the power of God. So God, his power is his self-sacrificial love. He uses this, his other-oriented love. And the lure of that, the beauty of that is his power. He doesn't just come down and give us all lobotomies so we all believe in him. He tries to win our hearts. And the beauty of the cross is him winning our hearts. So God's love is a self-sacrificial, other-oriented, never wavering, unsurpassable, perfect, cross-like kind of love. And that's why, the Bible sums up the whole gospel, but it says, John says that God is love, 1 John 4:8. And then he says, here's how we know what love is. Jesus Christ laid down his life for us. 1 John 3:16. So he defines love by pointing us to the cross. God is the core of God's essence, cross-like love, other-oriented, self-giving love. And so, this is what leads God to become a human being. And throughout Jesus' ministry, he demonstrates this. In John 13, I just love this thing. John sets it up by saying that Jesus, knowing that he had come from God and that all things had been put under his authority, wrapped a towel around his waist and began to wash the feet of his disciples, whom he knew were going to betray him and flee and abandon him. Yet one's going to deny him, and he's washing their feet. And then he says to them, I've given you an example, so go and do likewise. This is how you are to relate to one another. So what do you do when you've got all the power in the universe? That's the question that's being answered there. And we would think, I'll be Thor, I'll control all things. But Jesus puts a towel around his waist. And he assumes the role of a servant and washes the dirty, smelly feet of his very disciples who he knows are going to betray him. So that's the kind of God that if that's the kind of power that God relies on, then what kind of power should we rely on? And see, the kind of power that the world always craves after is power over others. Because you think your ways are better, you're smarter, or you care more than they do, and so you have to just win, right? And the more you can win, the more power you've got, and the more you're esteemed, and all that. It's power over, and we rely on that all the time. And there's cases in which it's appropriate, like parents with children, for example, where you need to you have to limit the domain of their freedom for their own good. But the kind of power that defines the kingdom is power under. It's power to serve, the power to sacrifice on behalf of another. That's what Jesus does for us. He shows us what we're worth by what he's willing to pay for us. And he's willing to pay everything. And so also we're to ascribe unsurpassable worth to others by how we interact with them and how we treat them. And to always respect their personhood, which means you don't try to coerce stuff.
So let me play devil's advocate. It's like, well, that's a nice select. That's a nice, and I've already drunk the Kool-Aid, so I'm just going to go ahead and just play along though. So that's a nice selective reading of the Bible. What about when Jesus, let's say in the book of Revelation, he's coming on a white stallion, he's got a sword coming out of his mouth, he's He's even tatted. I mean, he's going to come and every knee's going to bow, whether they like it or not.
He's got a commitment to make someone bleed, as a famous preacher once said.
That's right. And they're going to confess, whether they want to or not, that Jesus is Lord. That sounds coercive, right?
You are Lord.
I mean, judgment is coercive. It's like, you know what? You're sheeps, you're goats, and I'm sorting this out now.
What good would a coerced confession of Jesus' lordship do? It's like, what does that prove? It have no meaning. Anyways, yeah, okay, look at. So what's interesting, as you just said, is that Jesus has a sword coming out of his mouth. What kind of a sword is that? Especially if you're going to take on armies. Yeah, I get a sprained neck pretty quickly, I think. It's almost like a picture of a Monty Python movie, and Jesus
Exactly.
my man is back, and he's up there. I can beat you with one sword.
That's right.
It's a flesh wound.
Flesh wound.
wound.
But see, throughout the book of Revelation, that sword is the word of truth. It's the word of God, and it slays lies. And then he's riding into the battle, but he's covered in blood. Revelations 19, it's covered in blood. And that's a common portrait you find in the literature of the time, and even going back, you find it in the Old Testament, where Yahweh's depicted as this warrior, and he's returning from battle covered in blood. And being covered in blood was a badge of honor, because it meant that you slaughtered them, but they didn't slaughter you. And so it's a triumphant, kind of victorious thing. But so here Jesus has this blood all over him, but he hasn't gone into battle yet. What's up with that? And what John is communicating here is that, yeah, Jesus is a mighty warrior, and he fights ferociously. But the way he fights ferociously is not by shedding anyone else's blood, but by letting his own blood be shed. He's fighting with self-sacrificial love. And John, he uses graphically violent metaphors, but if you pay close attention, and I've got an essay on this on my website, renew.org, just do a little search on it. But he's got all this violent imagery, but if you read it carefully, he subverts it all to reverse its meaning. So the mighty warrior is one not who kills, but rather who is willing to be killed for the sake of enemies.
Yeah, the lamb that was slain.
John hears that the lion of the tribe of Judah is worthy to open the scroll. That's a mighty, ferocious, triumphant thing. But when he turns and looks, this is Revelations 5 now, what he sees is a slain lamb, slain little lamb. And so Jesus fights with the ferocity of a lion, but the way he fights is by laying down his life like a little lamb. And it's absolutely brilliant. I used to, honestly, when I first came to Christ, I was OD'd on Revelation, okay? So we knew who the Antichrist was. It was Henry Kissinger. And we had it all plotted out, and it's going to happen by 1975, no later for sure. And I got so burned out on that. I didn't like the book of Revelation up until maybe, I guess, 14, 15 years ago, when I first began to discover these authors who are pointing this out. Richard Bachman is one of them. And this nonviolent reading, really everything in the book of Revelation is simply a display of the victory of the cross.
It's beautiful.
That's all I'm saying. The cross will be victorious. And saying that to these people, saying, keep on being followers of the Lamb. The way you're victorious is that you don't cling to your life, even to the point of death. You just speak the word, and you bear testimony by the blood of the Lamb, meaning you imitate the Lamb, being willing to die.
Wow.
Oh.
Greg, what would you say are the most evident gaps between the way that Jesus leads and the way that leadership is carried out today?
Well, I think the major way is that, and I hope this is changing. Some have argued that this is changing, not only in the church, but in companies, that they're going more towards a plural leadership. But the major problem has been that we entrust the king. We entrust one person to be the architect for everything. So now everyone else's job is just to carry out that person's will. They're the only ones who really get to have a vision. And maybe they share portions of it with different people, but it's I'll interpret God for you. It's almost like the role of a high priest, you know. And so then the people never get to use their gifts. You know, they're just the gophers for the. And see, what's happening in the ministry of Jesus was nothing like that. In fact, he says explicitly, you know, that in the world, you know, and he says this right after John and his brother are fighting over who gets to sit next to Jesus. And so he says, you know what, the pagans, Gentiles, they lord over one another, and the ones who are lording over them are the benefactors. But it will not be so in my kingdom. Here, the first will be last, and the last will be first. And he just turns everything upside down. And so there's no role for any sort of authoritarian coercion in the body of Christ, as I see Jesus teaching. And he leads by serving. That's all he does. By serving. And then when you choose to follow him, he's got some good, real instructions to give you. But you can walk away, and sometimes they do walk away. But Jesus has come in doing what Jesus does. And he just modeled servant leadership throughout, most clearly and most explicitly and most beautifully on the cross.
So Greg, I want to ask you, you planted a church. It grew. It's a sizable, organized church.
Yeah.
And so what does that look like for you as a pastor of a large, organized church? What does self-sacrificial, cross-like leadership look like? Give me maybe a couple of examples that it might look different than in another church where it still really is the hierarchical model. And I know I'm kind of putting you on the spot, but I'm curious what that looks like for you.
Well, at the very least, it means that I want to be empowering others to do their gifts, to help them be plugged in to whatever ministry is going to best suit their gifts. And then when it comes to like making decisions on the church, it means that first of all, you invest the time that it takes to get to know people enough so you're not just doing a job together, but you're actually relating. That's one of the reason people go for the power over model is because it's so efficient.
It is. It's a lot quicker.
It's a lot quicker. But so you have to, make a decision that you're going to shoot for kingdom quality over some numerical quantity. That being faithful to the way of Jesus and how you lead is a high priority, higher than efficiency. And I will tell you from experience as a person who likes efficiency, that has been an area that the Lord has had to use like sandpaper to grade that down, because I have had to bite my tongue sometimes. But I get to know the person, know where they're gifted. They get to know me and where I'm gifted, and so you get to know the dynamics of this team. So that when decisions need to be made, we all have a say in this, but we kind of know we defer to this person. This is kind of where they're gifted. But it's an organic thing. It's not like they now have the official title, therefore we must listen to them. It's rather, he's the natural person to carry this task out along those lines. And that's just not the way that power over churches are structured at all.
Very good.
Let's say you were sitting across the table from a church planner, and they're asking you.
I've heard that I am.
Yeah, you are actually. There's probably a bunch of them listening right now. And they're asking, so where do I start, Greg? You're an old, grizzled, wizened Gandalf. What do I do? I'm a hobbit about to begin my journey.
Watch out for your precious.
Man, that's true.
No, it absolutely is true. Absolutely is true. The enemy is brilliant at leading you down ways that may seem good, but they're not God's will, and it just dangles a little precious. Okay, come get this. So, where do you start? That's like, well, you have to, if you're going to be a church planter, you better kind of know what you're doing. So, attending some seminars, getting some education about that, theological and practical, and so going to, the trouble is, you got to be careful where you go to get church planting, because they can be giving you the carbon copy power over model, and that's how you do it. So you have to find the organic church planners, or better yet, get yourself plugged into a church, a community, and find and they should all then be affirming your giftedness. That's another thing with in the body of Christ. We don't. If you get together with this large group of people once a week, you never have any kind of communal discernment. There's no togetherness there. But here, every decision that's significant should be a shared decision. I invite you in on my life, that if I'm going to make a major decision, career or otherwise, will you help discern this for me? Because we all got blind spots. And so it's very much of an empowering thing and a communal thing, and it's organic as opposed to the power over kind of thing. I would encourage folks who are considering going to ministry, but I encourage folks on this all the time, and that is make sure, and this goes to your precious, make sure that your precious is Jesus.
Mm-hmm.
Really is Jesus. And by that I mean that Jesus has got to be the source of your sense of well-being, the source of your being worthwhile, the source of your feeling significant, and the source of you feeling secure about that. Because to the degree that Jesus isn't meeting that need, despite the fact that he loves you as you are, to the degree that that's not true, you're going to start getting it from some other source. And for pastors, the source is usually the congregation.
Yeah, that's
so
it.
Now, the congregation becomes a way of making the pastor feel good. And the pastor doesn't probably know they're doing this, but the church is about them.
Mm-hmm.
And that's why, look how many numbers I have. Look at how high our offering is. Look how big our church steeple is. And it becomes sort of a pissing contest. It's like,
mm-hmm.
But they're still trying to hit a home run for dad in the bottom of the ninth and 6th grade when they struck out, and
Mm-hmm.
he lost. And so you can't go into this wounded. You can't go into this empty. Well, I mean, we're all kind of wounded, but knowing what your wounds are and be seeking healing for them and be getting all your life from Christ.
I think that's profound. And particularly one of the things I think we can be unaware of as church leaders is that vocational ministry context. It draws those of us who are broken and are desperately looking for affirmation. And there's actually in this kind of work, I heard a study recently about pastors, politicians, other careers that are about platform
Mm-hmm.
and crowds and, it's like 3 times higher a rate in the population of actual clinical narcissism. It's actually you have maybe 30% of the pastors who actually have a clinical mental health issue with narcissism. Because
the pastor that I was referring to as my first example, I was certain belongs in that category.
Mm.
You're right, and it would kind of attract folks along those lines. So you've got to anchor that in, because otherwise, what you find is, and when we first started Woodland Hills, I found this that when the attendance was growing, which it usually was, I felt happy, but then if it started shrinking or the offering started shrinking, then I felt a little sad, and it's like, well, that shouldn't be my criteria. And that's the Lord then helped me along. In 1 Corinthians 2, I woke up to this passage where Paul says, hey, one Paul's waters, one person plants, one person waters, but God gives the increase.
mm-hmm.
And that's when it's, okay, I got to let go of all the increase. That's on God, not me. And so I just do what I'm supposed to do and leave all the other results to God. If you start owning that stuff, then you'll go up and down and believe me, when you plant a church, there's a lot of ups and downs.
Well, let me ask you one other question in particular. So what would you recommend, first of all, for a leader doing that kind of soul care? Is there a particular book that's been helpful to you? And then the second question is also on theological reflection in terms of this orientation of leadership. What would be one of your books that you would recommend as the go-to? So first question, what would you recommend for a church leader in terms of doing a gut check, basically, on their own identity, motives? And then number 2, what book would you recommend from your library that would be a great place to start on this topic?
Okay. Well, there's an exercise that I do on a fairly regular basis that helps me do a gut check, as you call it. I encourage all the listeners to do this on their own, not to replicate what I do, but the Lord will lead you in your own unique way of doing this. But I see myself on this beach, and there's a river running alongside me to the right, and it's an autumn day, and there's the leaves are all just so beautiful. And I'm aware that Jesus is over to my left, though I don't make eye contact with him initially. And then various things that are important to me in my life are symbolically brought before me, or they just actually appear on the beach. Things that are valuable to me. And then there's a raft that is there, and I have to put this thing on the raft and then shove it off down the river. And then I watch it go around the bend. And so it starts with my books, and learning and stuff. That's very important to me. But, and then after each time I put it on the raft, I have to turn to Jesus. And that's when I say, you are enough.
Mm.
Then I took my health, and I was into sports at this earlier on in life. This isn't as much an issue now, but I put that on, send it down. And then at some point, you get rid of all your possessions. And then at some point, you have your family and friends. And that's when it gets tough. But I know I'm going to have to say goodbye to them one day. And this is kind of a rehearsal for that. But what it is, and then I'm always returning to Jesus saying, you are enough. And it's not that those things aren't important to me. They are, but Christ has to be enough for me to be who I am as a person. And the reason why I get out of bed and the thing that gives joy to my heart. And if that's not true, then you're going to have to get it from other sources. And that's what screws everything up.
So good.
Well, then the only thing
it's a rehearsal for death, really. And because that's what, when we die, everything we have to say goodbye to everything. That's what it means to die. And you naked will be before your Lord, and stripped of every defense. And so it's really good to rehearse that.
That's so good.
Because I think the best way to live is to live as though you'd already died. But you can only do that out of a fullness that you're getting from Christ.
That's so good.
That's rich, man.
Hey, the book question. I am terrible when it comes to remembering books, and super terrible, especially when it comes to any books on leadership, because the truth is I don't read books on leadership.
I guess what I was asking, Greg, is more like the theological foundations that would strengthen someone, where their view of God would then overflow into this kind of servant form of leadership. So like a cruciform view of power. Like, what would be a good book for someone to read along those lines?
Okay, good. You mentioned, a good book on soul searching and knowing the motives of your heart and stuff. And here, I got to say, Dallas Willard is, I think, for me, he's just, his book, Renovation of the Heart, Hearing God is excellent. What was the other one that he had that week? I just admitted I'm not good at remembering titles of books, but where he lays out that acronym. Anyways, he's got some really, really good stuff.
Yeah.
Good to go on that. As for the theological foundations of the church, there's another thing that church planners and everybody else needs to keep in mind, and that is that the most important factor of your life is what is your mental picture of God, and that is because we always become in the image of God that we worship.
Yes.
And so the beauty of your life will never outrun the beauty of the God that you worship.
Come on.
And your passion for God will never outrun the beauty of your conception of God. And I meet many people who, if you ask them what their theology is, they'll give you, God is love, God is this, God is that, whatever. But what's really going on in their head is something less than beautiful. And they blame themselves because they're not as on fire for God as maybe some other people are. But the truth is that anybody who saw the kind of God that they see when they think about God would have the same emotion.
Yeah.
Or maybe even anger, or maybe even rage. Your picture of God is all important. And here's where I think it's so crucial that we trust that when Jesus says, if you see me, you see the Father, he's telling the truth. And trust that he says at the hour of the cross is when he most glorifies the Father. John chapter 12. And so to keep your eyes on God who's revealed on the cross and all his beauty. And to trust that really is what God is like all the way down. The Hebrews 1:3 said that the Son, unlike all previous revelations, the Son is the radiance of God's glory, like the shininess of God's shininess, and the exact likeness of his very essence. He uses this word hypostasis, very essence. They got approximations in the past, but now we've got the exact deal here. Keep your eyes on Jesus. That raises questions I know that we can't get into here about what about the violent God that you find sometimes in the Old Testament. And I'll just throw this out. I last year came out with 2 books on that topic. A real academic one called Crucifixion of the Warrior God, if you want all the details, or a popular version of it is called Cross Vision. And they just came out with a study guide for Cross Vision. So there's that too. It helps people interpret these violent portraits of God through the lens of the cross and to see something else going on there. I'll leave it at that.
Yeah, I highly highly recommend it. There's one last thing that I think I know about you, even though it's the first time we've ever met. You're an avid drummer, right?
I love to drum.
Yep. So I imagine when you're doing that prayer exercise and you're at the very end and now you've passed your family on to Jesus, the very last thing you give him is your Ludwig drum set.
Well, it actually be even harder now because I upgraded it last Christmas. I got myself a Christmas present, so I got a real nice set now. And so, but I don't think it'd be the last thing.
I'm just calling you out, man. I know where your idolatry is.
Just before my kids, all right? They'll be up there.
You're a guy who starts every podcast with yourself drumming. Hello.
I'm kind of sneaking in there. Finding ways to do legitimate drumming, by theology. It's kind of hard to do.
Oh, it's funny.
Well, hey, Greg, where can people find your stuff on the internet, man? If they want to dig in, where do they go?
Renew.org, and that's with a K, REKNEW. You got to kind of relearn everything. That's sort of our motif. And there you'll find all sorts of podcasts and essays, and we got a great search engine, I'm told. So I got a lot of writings there and things like that.
Yeah, one of my favorite podcasts is Greg's podcast. He answers questions from listeners pretty much every week, so it's kind of fun.
I have a lot of fun doing it.
Greg, we thank you so much for being with us.
Bless you guys. Keep up the good work. Love what you're doing. Love what you stand for. And I bless you for teaching me about starfish today.
There we go. Okay. Thanks again.
Thanks, Greg.
Bye-bye.
Bye.